Hi, I would like to read a chapter from my memoir, A Quarter Inch from My Heart. It's the chapter that a lot of my readers call the Christmas chapter. Chapter 16. After the attack, my physical recovery time was rather brief considering the near-miss location of the chest wound, but emotionally I was sliding. On the phone one day, I griped to a friend, wondering where the silver lining was. The silver lining is, you lived, he stated. There could be no greater truth, but I was too bitter to hear it. I was still wishing Granger had finished me off. I had always been able to bounce back from anything, large or small. I had patiently waited out years of being slammed into lockers in high school, hardly ever missing a day of school. I had endured an angry father who drank too much and a mother who had just enough strength to maintain a working household, let alone take on my psychological issues. In New York, I had survived awful jobs and no jobs, shaky tenures with questionable roommates, endless rounds of futile auditioning, the heartbreaks of foolish young love, and even a mugging at gunpoint. From all of it, I had bounced back. I was like the Weeble, a toy that had been advertised for several years when I was a kid. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. The recovery was proving to be more difficult because it seemed to take on the weight of all those other issues, some of which had never been resolved. As for that defiant, the show must go on stance I had adopted for that performance in November, there had been no reviewers there to commend my performance and no reporters to follow up on my progress. I was yesterday's news, papery dry and blowing aimlessly in the momentary breezes. The Christmas season had always been my favorite time of year, but when it rolled around in 1994, I was in no mood for it. My mind was in a state of shock, and nothing, neither joyful nor tragic, could seem to pull me out of my cement-like day-to-day existence. If anyone had tried to talk to me about Christmas miracles, I'd have met him with, at best, a stone-faced, if not a scowl. After that first week of Survivor's Glee back in October, I was sinking down into the depths of something that was beyond the reach of even Rafe, my therapist. I didn't think it was possible, but the grind of my office job was worse than it had ever been, my eyes glazing over legal documents as I counted down the hours until the end of the day, only to go home and stare at the television screen. The trip back to Massachusetts for the holidays was my first out-of-town getaway since the stabbing. And while my parents' house in the woods on a dirt road was certainly getting out of the city, it promised to be anything but relaxing. My anger at my father hung over me like a shroud. Why hadn't he come to New York during my hour of greatest need? My siblings bickering over trivial matters threatened to make me come undone, a tightly wrapped Christmas package collapsing to reveal nothing inside. My fears were not unfounded. As I walked into the living room and plopped my things down, the pettiness was already starting. I looked to the sliding glass door on the far side of the room. Outside the door, on the deck, sat a plump 5-foot-high Christmas tree, sparkling with tinsel and multicolored lights. The wrapped gifts were piled on the other side of the door, inside. My sister Wendy said with a snort, "Mom decided she didn't want to bother with putting on ornaments and vacuuming up pine needles this year. Doesn't that look dumb?" I shrugged, smiled wanly, and took my luggage to my room. In November, I had met with the district attorney. My medical bills, over $10,000, were coming in, and I had no idea what to do. I asked the DA if I could sue Granger. He shrugged. "You could only sue if someone like Donald Trump stabbed you, someone with deep pockets." There wasn't much to learn about Granger beyond what was in the newspaper accounts. I seemed to remember that he was an aspiring screenwriter. He worked for a delivery service like FedEx. He had assaulted a city councilman the year before. He liked to ride his bike, but nothing about his family or where he came from. What could have been his motive? To make matters worse, one of the two police officers who tackled Granger an hour or so after he stabbed me, a heroic deed for which he was roundly praised in the press, committed suicide a few days before Christmas. I had met the officer in November when I gave my testimony to the grand jury. He had been so young, polite, and compassionate. In addition to the tragedy of his loss, how would it affect my case? I don't remember much about the time leading up to Christmas Day. I spent a couple of long days curled up on the couch looking at the tree lights and smelling the baking pies. We must have gone to the Christmas Eve service at the church we'd attended since I was a small child, but I don't remember being moved. We certainly carried on our tradition of singing Christmas carols late into the night back home after the church service. That had always been a highlight at our house. My father would pull out the dog-eared Christmas book and we'd go through it from beginning to end. He'd play piano and we'd sing along to most of the 100 songs in the book. Immediate family and a few close friends would participate. My best friend Paula from my growing up years and her mother Jidge, who were like family, joined us every year. The evening would always start out reverently, but after a couple of hours and a fair amount of eggnog, the musicality would go right out the window. Paula and I would try to out-belt each other, and Jidge, a heavy smoker, would cough and rasp her way through the latter part of the evening. We'd all try to add jazz riffs and fancy endings to the simplest songs like Silent Night. Often we'd fall to our knees gasping for breath from laughing so hard at a particularly creative and ridiculous rendition of a classic. My father and I were more alike than not. When the going got tough, we knew how to perform. I have no particular memory of the Christmas Eve sing-along of 1994. Surely it happened and surely I carried on as usual, but my mind was elsewhere. I did not sleep much that night, and it wasn't because I was anxiously anticipating the arrival of Santa Claus. I got up early at the first light of day before anyone else in the house had stirred. I felt the need to gaze at the tree lights again. I tiptoed out of my room and walked into the living room. I was stunned by what I saw. A light snow was falling, and about an inch of fine powder had already fallen. The snow had softly blanketed the tree on the deck, and the glistening lights were now muted reds, blues, yellows, and greens. I stood alone, staring at the tree, my hands hanging limply at my sides, tears creeping out of the sides of my eyes. Soon the tears were cascading down my cheeks, and I covered my face with my hands so that my gut-wrenching sobs would not wake up the household. In that moment, the feeble little tree that had been exiled to the cold porch became the most beautiful Christmas tree I had ever seen. No stocking stuffer, brightly wrapped gift, scrumptious pumpkin pie, or heartfelt song would come close to matching the gift of that tree in 1994. In the early hours of Christmas morning, a simple tree covered with colored snow, became a symbol of peace and hope for me. My struggle to overcome the psychological damage of the October event would go on for at least another year. But that morning, in letting go of my grief, I was at last able to embrace life. I wanted to live.